asked him, What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer.
Thank you, Joseph. I saw a post on social media where someone said, yesterday I got fired from my job, but this morning I showed up for work and clocked in. How long until they notice? I spent most of my years of high school working at a guitar store, which for me was a dream job. I really, really enjoyed that for a few years. But there was one guy that they hired along the way. And the thing that used to happen with this guy was he would pretty frequently go on these breaks, but he'd always come back with these ridiculous-sized milkshakes from Baskin-Robbins just down the road. I mean, really large ones. And I remember at one point I asked him, how do you keep buying all these milkshakes? He said, well, it was only $1. I said, well, how did you do that? He said, oh, see, all my buddies work at Baskin-Robbins, and so when I go, I just tell them I'm a cop, and I'll get a cop discount. They're kind of tit-for-tat kind of things. His buddies were hooking him up with these really cheap beverages or free beverages, and I remember when the owner of the guitar store learned about this, he got quite concerned, as you can imagine. He said, I know exactly how that scenario works. So he goes to Baskin-Robbins, and they do favors for him. What are they expecting when they come into my music store? Because they better not be walking away from here with free stuff. That guy didn't last too long at the store. An interesting story in 2016, if you were shopping for hotel rooms at the Marriott, there was a sudden discount that no one had really planned on. A lot of rooms that would have typically cost between $159 up to $499 for a night suddenly went on sale. No announcement about the sale coming, and all of a sudden you could get these very same rooms anywhere from $12 to $59 a night. All 3,000 rooms were available at this pricing. And the owners of the Marriott managers were quite concerned because no one had talked about this special. And they started doing their research and had figured out an employee they had fired named Juan Rodriguez, who had access to their website. He had figured out from his house how to hack back into their computer, and to get back at them for firing him, he reduced all the prices down to those bare minimum prices. Well, they were able to trace his IP address. That didn't end very well for him. But in Jesus' parable that we're looking at today, we're talking about a fairly high-level manager who, it says that he was accused of poorly managing the assets of his master, and then he proceeds to give us evidence of that, right? He starts doing some terrible things with it. I wanted to complete this reading. So he says there's a master who goes to this manager and says, you're not going to be manager anymore because of how badly you've managed things. So it says in verse 3, the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied, large quantity. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in their dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The word of the Lord. Amen. That's a strange passage, isn't it? It's a strange passage. So what exactly is he doing here? Commentators have gone a lot of different directions with this story, as you can imagine. Some of them are trying to find some way to make this manager turn out to be virtuous, so that maybe by what he's doing and cutting the people's bills, he's actually saving the company or something like that. But the truth is, Jesus is labeling this guy as someone who's not especially admirable, and I would suggest this is not a person we need to have pity for at all. This manager is a very powerful manager of the household. He's clearly got enough power that he can make decisions about loans, right? So he's managing his master's financial resources. So he's got a lot of influence in what he's able to do. And of course, the expectation in what he's doing is that after I've done you this favor, when I get into a time of need, hopefully they're going to do me some kind of a favor. He's expecting some kind of quid pro quo where they're going to take care of him. I think it's also very telling that this is a man who's not interested in actually working. Do you notice what he says to himself? Well, I know I can't dig, and I'm too proud to beg. You know, I don't want a job, I just want a paycheck. And so how can I do something quickly to watch out for my back to make sure this all turns out okay for me? This is the kind of guy where if you found out he lost his job and you lined him up a new job at a company, this is the kind of guy who wouldn't show up for day one, right? This is a guy not interested in working. He's interested in working the system to his benefit. Along with this, as we read this story, there's a term Jesus uses, like for example, there in verse 9, he says, I tell you, use worldly wealth. There are different translations who handle that term differently, but he's not saying ill-gotten gain. He's not saying, I tell you Christians to use your ill-gotten money for good purposes. He's simply speaking of money that belongs to the world. Kind of like when Jesus was able to look at the coin and say, you know, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's. He's talking about money that is worldly money as opposed to things that are of true value in the kingdom of God. So when he's saying use worldly wealth, he's not talking specifically about ill-gotten gain. He's just saying, think about what you do with your financial resources. Along with this, Jesus is not making the point that we're supposed to use our money somehow to earn our salvation. So you're not trying to use your ill-gotten gain to purchase your salvation. And another thing he's not saying is that you're supposed to be using your ill-gotten worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself so that when you're lost, you'll have other people who are your buddies that are lost with you. You know, there's that famous quote from Mark Twain where he says, when I think about heaven or hell, he liked to talk about Christians as being kind of stuck-up, stuffy people. He says, I think I would choose heaven for the climate, but hell for the companionship. You know, thinking about the kind of people. And sometimes you'll hear people say those things. Well, you know, I think I'm going to be lost, but me and my buddies, we're just going to keep partying it up down there the way we do up here. Everything Jesus says about the afterlife would indicate that that's not even a remote possibility. But he's not suggesting here that people who aren't Christians should just go ahead and make as many friends as they can for when they don't enter the kingdom of heaven. That's also not, I think, what he's saying. One thing that might be helpful for us in understanding this strange passage is to pay attention that in verse 1, it says this is a parable Jesus is speaking to his disciples. So who is the target audience? He's talking to believers in this passage. And I would say it's the only way verse 9 makes any sense. He's talking to people who are his followers, who are believers, who are already Christians. And he's saying, use this money that's part of the world, that belongs to the world, in order to do things that have eternal value. He says, one day your money is going away. Your money is going to perish with everything else in the world. Your possessions are going to go away with the rest of the world. But as a Christian, you understand there are some things you could be doing with what you have that do possess eternal value, ongoing significance. And because we as Christians are wise about this, we understand the true nature of our assets and our resources. We understand the true nature of spirituality and where all things are leading. We should therefore make much better decisions than the world does about how we use the things that we have. Also in this passage, notice that Jesus doesn't praise the man's character. He's not praising his actions for what he did in cutting those bills when he shouldn't have been doing that. Jesus doesn't say those were good things. The part that he's praising is the man's shrewdness. He was at least smart enough to see the situation that he was in and to make an informed decision about his future. It's one of those how much more type of passages. If it's true in this sense, how much more should it be true for us? If this ungodly, shrewd person makes that decision for his own well-being, how much more so should we as Christians make good decisions for our own well-being? This is a passage that highlights for us the difference between people in the world and those of us who are claiming to be children of light. To some degree, this comes down to optimism and pessimism, doesn't it? I used to have a friend in college who was always very negative and very pessimistic, and I remember one time I kind of challenged him on this and said, you know, why do you always have to be so down and so negative? And he said, well, Mark, you know, the advantage of being a pessimist is that I'm either always right or I'm pleasantly surprised. Thought about that. I mean, that is kind of the perk of pessimism. Anytime something goes bad, you can say, I told you so. And if something goes well, you can say, well, it's good that it turned out that way, but who would have ever known that could happen? Pessimism is something that's appealing to the world because the world is quite familiar with the world. The world is able to look around and always assume the worst. And frankly, a lot of people are on that path, that broad path that leads to destruction. Unfortunately, you can count on people to be corrupt, to abuse their power, to take advantage of those weaker than them. That's something it's pretty easy to predict, and it's easy to find. But we, as people of light, are trying to live differently, and for that reason, we are trying to live as people who are more optimistic. That even if a person is one way, with a little help and another opportunity, they could live a better way. They could do better than that. Now, what's the truth? The truth is sometimes we'll give people that second chance, and we'll get burned on it, won't we? Sometimes people take our forgiveness, our compassion, those extra opportunities, and they turn it right back around, and they take advantage of us. And I think Jesus is telling us, as children of light, sometimes that is going to be the case. The people of the world are very shrewd, because we're not trying to make decisions just on practicality. We're trying to make decisions based on the love of Christ. Love that believes all things and hopes all things and endures all things and allows for new opportunities and second chances and starting over again. Love believes that better is really possible with God's help. But it's hard to be a person who's an optimist in a world full of pessimism. So he says, if we're going to live among the world, we can at least learn a lesson from people like this shrewd manager. He was thinking about his own temporary well-being. He was watching his back. And we as Christians who know where things are really going, how much more so should we think about things of eternal significance? So we read down to verse 9. I want to continue, and I want you to hear Jesus' own application of this teaching, because he does make one. He says in verse 10, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." That's Jesus' point. That's where he's going with that story. We have to choose who it is that we're going to serve. I've always wondered a lot what it's going to be like on the day of judgment. You know, when you stand before God, sometimes I get caught up in thinking about the beauty of the scenery and what all will be present and who will be there and what is it like to stand before God. And then some of the time I think about how is it exactly that God goes about judging us? I mean, the real act of looking over our life. So imagine, if you will, that you're standing there on the day of judgment and it's your turn to be judged, and you stand there and one of the angels says to God, "Well, are you ready to watch the video of their life? We've got the whole thing from beginning to end on tape. We can show you the whole thing if you'd like to watch that before you pass your judgment." And God says, "Well, we could do that, but that might take a little bit long." And they said, "Well, how about this?" They get out this big whopping volume that is a novel about every detail of everything you've ever done. And again, God says, "I know that's very thorough, but I'm not convinced it's entirely necessary." And so the angel says, "Well, what exactly do you think we should do?" And God said, "Well, you know, as Jesus and I always say, where a person's treasure is, that's where their heart is. So rather than sort through all that extra stuff, just get me a copy of their bank statements and I'll be able to tell quite a bit about where their heart is." It's a spooky thought, isn't it? You cannot serve both God and money, Jesus says. What could be a more telling test of true discipleship than how we use the things that we've been given, what we do with our possessions? This is very much a parable about possessions and resources. If we're going to serve God rather than serve things, or serve God rather than serve money, it should mean several things. At the very least, it should mean that we don't just hoard resources, continue being consumers who just buy and buy and buy and buy and accumulate without ever giving anything away or getting rid of anything or thinking about those less fortunate than us. We don't hoard possessions. And along with that, if we really value God more than we value stuff, that should be evidenced through the things that we support. This is a week that we had some neat things happen. I know this was the week with the Coastal Bend Day of Giving. And in fact, just connected to our congregation, there were 3 major charities involved. There was Help, Ridges Charity. We had Youth Odyssey that James Gurley is heavily involved in, and also New Life Behavior. So we had several of our own ministries, and it was so encouraging to see just how generous people can be in supporting good works and good things. We saw a lot of people in our community come together to use their resources in good and uplifting and socially responsible ways. But if we're honest, the truth is, a lot of Christians, much of the time, will use our financial resources and all our possessions in ways that are utterly indistinguishable from the way that the world uses these things. If you think about yourself, between our homes and our vehicles and our hobbies and all the things that we have to do, we can get ourselves spent financially to the point where even if a really good opportunity came along that we wanted to support, because we've gotten ourselves in debt up to our eyeballs, we're incapable of doing any good in that sense. We have to be good stewards of what it is that God has given us. And I think Jesus would say this is a deeply spiritual matter. And even if you're in a position financially to give, there's another way to think about this in terms of just your time and your energies and your talents and those resources. We can have so many possessions that even if you wanted to volunteer some time somewhere, all of your time is already spent just maintaining the stuff that you own that requires so much effort to keep it looking good and the way that it should. But what we do with our possessions, Jesus says, is a deeply spiritual matter. And so he asks this rhetorical question, which is one we all need to think about. If you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly money, who will trust you with true riches? If we're not responsible with the stuff of the world, if we're not at least shrewd enough to know this stuff is going away, it's not eternal, if God can't trust us now with stuff that's small and insignificant, why would he give us anything that's greater than that? If we can't be trusted with the small things, why would he trust us with the larger things and give us more? So Jesus tells this parable, strange parable about this dishonest manager. He doesn't commend his actions, but he does commend his shrewdness, that he was able to look at his life, look at what was coming up in the near future, and make a wise decision about how he used what was at his disposal. And so the challenge for each of us is just to ask that question of ourselves. And really, this is not between you and me. This is between you and God. How are you using the things that God has given you? And could God look at your possessions and what you have and know clearly that you're a Christian? Could he know where your heart is by how you're using these things that you've been given? Because they are a reflection of ourselves, what we do with these things. So that's a question for all of us to dwell on. We have a lot of different things happening this time of year. I know with holidays coming up, this is a period of time where some of us are excited to see family. For some of us, this is a time of difficulty because we remember those that we've lost. We're going to be emotionally all over the charts the next few weeks, I'm sure. But if there's any way this morning you need somehow to respond, whether to the message specifically or you've just got something in your life you'd like us to be praying about, if there's any way we could be an encouragement to you this morning, we're happy to do that. We would invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing.